I never meant to call you when
To show how deep is your love.
What if the same voice that made the world dance was also the same voice that made the world blush? In the 1970s, three brothers from Britain stormed the charts with voices so high, so insistent, that they practically redefined what pop music could sound like. Their falsetto wasn't gentle, it was piercing, relentless, a call to arms for the disco generation. These voices belonged to the Bee Gees, and for a time they were unstoppable. But a decade later, another figure emerged, a single man, dressed in lace and purple, playing guitar like a god and whispering into microphones like a lover. He too leaned on falsetto. But his version was different. It wasn't communal, it wasn't about dance floors. It was private, seductive, dangerous. That man was Prince. Here's the mystery. How could one vocal technique define two entirely different eras? How could it be the anthem of disco excess in the 70s and the sound of sexual liberation in the 80s? And most importantly, who really owned falsetto in pop music? The Bee Gees or Prince? It's a question of survival versus seduction, a story of reinvention, backlash, and legacy. And by the time we reach the end, you'll realize the battle over falsetto wasn't just about music, it was about identity itself. Before we dive deep, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. This is where we peel back the glitter, the myths, and the headlines to uncover the real stories behind the voices that shaped generations. From stadium anthems to whispered confessions, every sound has a secret, and we're here to tell them. So hit that button because today you're about to learn why the Bee Gees and Prince will forever be locked in an invisible duel over the same voice. The Bee Gees weren't supposed to be disco kings. In the 1960s, Barry, Robin, and Morris Gibb were often compared to the Beatles. They wrote heartfelt ballads, rich harmonies, and songs that seemed destined to soundtrack gentle romance. Hits like Massachusetts and To Love Somebody
Back to Massachusetts.
placed them firmly in the tradition of British pop's melodic masters. But by the early 1970s, the music scene had shifted. Rock became harder, folk became introspective, and suddenly the Bee Gees sounded outdated. Audiences moved on, and the group risked fading away entirely. Their concerts drew smaller crowds, and record sales began to stall. Then came 1975. While recording Nights on Broadway in Miami, producer Arif Mardin asked Barry Gibb to try something unusual. Scream in tune, he suggested, hoping to add something fresh to the track. What followed was an experiment. Barry reached for a falsetto that sliced above the harmony like a knife. No one knew it then, but that moment changed everything. By leaning into falsetto, the Bee Gees discovered a weapon that could rescue them from irrelevance. Soon, their songs began to shimmer with this new sound. Jive Talkin', You Should Be Dancing, and then of course, Stayin' Alive. The Bee Gees had reinvented themselves overnight, and disco embraced them. Their falsetto became inseparable from the genre's energy, urgent, ecstatic, relentless. When the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack was released in 1977, the Bee Gees weren't just part of disco, they were disco, and falsetto was their crown. But here's the problem. Crowns don't stay unchallenged. Because while the Bee Gees ruled the dance floor, somewhere in Minneapolis, a young man was learning how to use falsetto in an entirely different way. He wasn't interested in survival, he was interested in seduction, and when he arrived, he would redefine falsetto forever. The Bee Gees didn't invent falsetto. That credit goes to centuries of singers, from Renaissance choirs to doo-wop groups. But the Bee Gees reinvented how the mainstream heard it. Barry's falsetto wasn't smooth like Smokey Robinson's or Curtis Mayfield's. It was sharper, more commanding. Layered with Robin and Morris's voices, it created something new. A falsetto that wasn't fragile, it was dominant. In Stayin' Alive, Barry's falsetto isn't a whisper. It's a cry, a declaration of resilience. Ha 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 ha, Stayin' Alive, he belts.
Staying alive, staying alive.
Not timidly, but defiantly. In an era when masculinity in rock often meant growling baritones, the Bee Gees turned high-pitched falsetto into an anthem of toughness. Audiences went wild. The Saturday Night Fever soundtrack sold over 40 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling albums of all time. In clubs across America, Men and women alike danced to the Bee Gees' falsetto choruses, their voices cutting through mirror balls and smoke machines. But fame comes with consequences. By the late 1970s, disco faced growing resentment. Some critics accused it of being artificial, shallow, even unmanly. When Chicago's infamous Disco Demolition Night erupted in 1979, it wasn't just records being smashed, it was a cultural backlash. And right at the center of the storm stood the Bee Gees. Their falsetto-laden sound turned into a punchline. For the brothers, falsetto had saved their careers, but now it made them targets. The same voice that lifted them to stardom was being mocked across the country. And this set the stage perfectly for someone new to claim falsetto as his own. In 1979, as disco collapsed under the weight of ridicule, a young Prince Rogers Nelson released his breakthrough single, I Wanna Be Your Lover. From the first note, listeners heard something startling. Prince's voice didn't growl, it didn't shout, it floated, an airy, delicate falsetto that carried through the entire song. But unlike the Bee Gees, who used falsetto for urgency and communal anthems, Prince used it differently. His falsetto was seductive, intimate. It felt less like a disco ball shining over a crowd, and more like a whisper meant for one person alone. Critics took notice. Here was a 21-year-old singer, blending funk, pop, and soul, and putting falsetto front and center, not as a gimmick, but as a statement. And he wasn't stopping there. By 1980, Dirty Mind made Prince infamous. The lyrics were raw, the performances bold, and the falsetto impossible to ignore. On Do Me Baby, he used falsetto not as decoration, but as drama. He moaned, whispered, and soared into registers that blurred the line between song and seduction. It was shocking, and it was deliberate. Where the Bee Gees had once been mocked for falsetto, Prince reclaimed it as a symbol of power. He didn't run from the accusations of effeminacy that haunted falsetto singers. He embraced them, twisted them, and turned them into rebellion. By the mid-1980s, Prince had perfected the formula. On Kiss, his falsetto wasn't just a vocal choice, it was the entire identity of the song. Stripped down, funky, and erotic, it became a #1 hit. Falsetto had survived the death of disco, and Prince was the reason. For decades, falsetto carried baggage. To some critics, it was seen as weak, effeminate, or unnatural. When the Bee Gees ruled disco, their falsetto-heavy songs became symbols of a genre many ridiculed. By the late 1970s, falsetto was often used as an insult in rock magazines, but Prince refused to play by those rules. When he sang falsetto, he didn't apologize. He leaned into it so much that it became his trademark, and by doing so, he reshaped the cultural meaning of falsetto itself. In songs like Do Me Baby, his falsetto wasn't timid, it was commanding, it was erotic, it was dangerous. Audiences weren't laughing at him, they were mesmerized. This wasn't weakness, this was dominance, and in a cultural landscape still obsessed with rigid ideas of masculinity, Prince's falsetto became radical. He wore lace and heels, played guitar with blistering aggression, and then slipped into a falsetto that sounded like seduction itself. The contradiction was the point, and that contradiction gave falsetto something new: respect. Falsetto has always existed on the margins of popular music. Long before the Bee Gees or Prince, it was present in doo-wop groups of the 1950s, in Motown classics of the 1960s, and in gospel choirs where male singers reached high notes that seemed otherworldly. But those were often isolated flourishes, brief moments that stood out precisely because they were rare. What the Bee Gees did was take that rarity and turn it into a foundation. Their falsetto wasn't background, it was front and center. By stacking Barry's sharp falsetto on top of Robin's and Morris's harmonies, they created a sound wall that filled entire dance floors. It was no longer a novelty, it was the entire identity of a song. When Saturday Night Fever hit theaters in 1977, audiences didn't just watch John Travolta strut down Brooklyn streets, they heard Barry's falsetto as the heartbeat of the era. Staying Alive wasn't only a disco anthem, it became a global soundtrack for survival. The falsetto became inseparable from the identity of the 1970s, even more recognizable than the electric guitar riffs of classic rock. But falsetto's survival into the next decade wasn't guaranteed. The Disco Demolition Night riot of 1979 wasn't just about destroying records, it was about destroying an entire sound. Critics mocked falsetto as artificial, feminine, and commercial. The Bee Gees bore the brunt of that criticism. They became shorthand for what disco haters despised, and yet falsetto didn't die, because just as disco collapsed, Prince rose. Prince understood falsetto differently. Where Barry Gibb used it like a shout of defiance, Prince used it like a whisper of seduction. In I Wanna Be Your Lover, 1979, the falsetto wasn't background decoration, it was the main instrument. He used it from the first line to the last, daring audiences to take him seriously in a register many men avoided. Then came Dirty Mind in 1980, where songs like Do Me Baby made falsetto the language of eroticism. Prince was telling the world, masculinity isn't limited to deep growls and chest-beating anthems. Masculinity can moan, tremble, and still command attention. By the mid-1980s, with Kiss, Prince had fully weaponized falsetto. That song works because of what it leaves out. No lush harmonies, no big production, just a stripped-down beat, and a voice darting into falsetto at every turn. It was minimalism as seduction, and it made falsetto permanent. And this duality, Bee Gees as falsetto's mainstream conquerors, Prince as falsetto's cultural liberator, echoed through the generations. Michael Jackson is the bridge between them. His falsetto cries in Don't Stop Till You Get Enough recall the Bee Gees' urgency, while his breathy falsetto on Human Nature reflects Prince's intimacy. He borrowed from both schools and brought falsetto into stadiums. The Weeknd has said in interviews that he studied both the Bee Gees and Prince. His Can't Feel My Face channels disco's falsetto energy, while Earned It drips with Prince-style sensuality. Justin Timberlake owes his falsetto-based career to this lineage. Cry Me a River could easily be mistaken for a modern Prince ballad, while Rock Your Body dances in Bee Gees territory. Even female artists, Beyoncé, Mariah Carey, Ariana Grande, have folded falsetto techniques into their arsenal, proving the style is no longer tied to gender or stigma. So here's the paradox. Falsetto is now universal. It's respected, it's cool. But ask someone on the street about the Bee Gees' falsetto, and they might laugh. Ask about Prince's falsetto, and they'll call it genius. Why? Why does history crown one as revolutionary and reduce the other to parody? The answer may lie in the rumors, stories, whispers, and speculation about how Prince viewed falsetto, masculinity, and perhaps even the Bee Gees themselves. When we step into Prince's world, we encounter both brilliance and mystery. Prince was famously private, selective about interviews, and deliberate in his words. He left behind countless performances, but relatively few candid statements about other artists. That silence created fertile ground for speculation. Music historians agree, there is no record of Prince mocking the Bee Gees in interviews, press conferences, or even informal backstage chatter. His influences were well documented. James Brown's stagecraft, Sly and the Family Stone's funk, Joni Mitchell's lyricism, and Curtis Mayfield's falsetto. The Bee Gees' names never appeared on those lists. But silence, in a world hungry for rivalry, is rarely neutral. Fans and journalists filled the gaps with stories. Some biographers, though without hard evidence, have suggested Prince may have looked at disco falsetto as a commercial trick, rather than an organic expression. Prince had roots in R&B and gospel traditions, where falsetto carried deep emotional and cultural weight. Compared to Curtis Mayfield's spiritual falsetto, the Bee Gees' sharp, disco-polished version might have seemed artificial. This rumor has circulated in fan forums and second-hand anecdotes, but it remains unverified. No direct quote from Prince supports it. One of the most persistent whispers among longtime fans is that, in the early 1980s, Prince supposedly told his band during rehearsals, "We're not doing Bee Gees falsetto." The implication: he wanted his falsetto to be seen as soulful and authentic, not tied to disco parody. But again, no recording or first-hand testimony exists to confirm this. The story lives mostly in online discussions and in books that blend rumor with fact. It's an alluring theory, but it cannot be proven. Some historians argue that Prince's refusal to even mention the Bee Gees was itself a kind of dismissal. After all, it's hard to believe that an artist as astute as Prince wasn't aware of their role in popularizing falsetto. By not citing them, did he silently erase them from falsetto's lineage? Or was he simply uninterested in acknowledging an act so far removed from his own creative world? We can't know for sure. But the absence of acknowledgement has been interpreted by some as rivalry by omission. On the other side, there's no mystery. Barry Gibb openly admired Prince. In interviews, he called Prince untouchable and praised his musicianship and stagecraft. Barry didn't see him as competition, he saw him as an icon. And this asymmetry, Barry giving respect, Prince staying silent, created the conditions for endless speculation. So what's real? What's rumor? The facts tell us there was no direct battle. The rumors tell us audiences wanted one. Because rivalry, whether true or invented, makes history more dramatic. And maybe that's the point. The Bee Gees and Prince never exchanged blows, but their fans, critics, and the culture at large did. One falsetto became parody. The other became legend. The question is, why? And what shadows did those choices leave behind? The silence between the Bee Gees and Prince has always fascinated fans, not because there was proof of rivalry, but because the absence of acknowledgement created a vacuum, and vacuums attract stories. Prince's career was full of quiet competitions. His most famous was with Michael Jackson. Verified accounts tell us Prince turned down Michael's invitation to duet on Bad in 1987, reportedly saying, "That line, 'Your butt is mine,' who's singing that to who? Because you ain't singing that to me."
I said, who gonna sing that to whom? Because you sure ain't singing it to me.
Prince wasn't afraid to draw lines. He wanted to be separate, distinct, and unmatched. So it's not hard for fans to imagine that same mentality extending to the Bee Gees. If he wouldn't risk being compared to Michael, why would he acknowledge Barry Gibb? Several second-hand stories suggest that in private conversations, Prince dismissed disco as shallow compared to funk. Since the Bee Gees were disco's poster children, it's easy to assume he lumped them into that critique. But again, no tape, no interview, no quote exists to confirm it. It's pure speculation. Another rumor suggests that when choosing material for live shows, Prince once rejected a Bee Gees cover suggestion, saying he didn't want that kind of falsetto associated with his band. But like the others, this remains unverified. His set lists throughout his career were famously eclectic. He covered Led Zeppelin, Joni Mitchell, Radiohead, but never the Bee Gees. Was that preference or coincidence? We can't know. Prince deeply respected Curtis Mayfield, Smokey Robinson, and gospel singers who used falsetto long before disco. For him, falsetto had spiritual and sensual roots. If anything, he may have felt no need to mention the Bee Gees, not out of malice, but because his falsetto lineage came from another tree. Meanwhile, Barry Gibb never shied away from praising Prince. In a 2000s interview, he said, "Prince was one of those people you couldn't copy. He had a magic all his own." So here's the irony. While fans argued over imagined slights, the truth may have been far more mundane. Prince simply didn't see the Bee Gees as part of his conversation. They lived in different worlds, and yet that silence created a narrative. It gave critics permission to crown Prince the falsetto king and reduce the Bee Gees to disco relics. The battle was never sung on stage, it was written afterward, in the way history chose to remember them. Every falsetto carries a shadow, and for these two legacies, the shadows could not have been more different. For the Bee Gees, falsetto was both salvation and curse. It saved their careers in the mid-1970s, turning them from fading balladeers into disco gods. But it also made them targets of ridicule when disco collapsed. Comedians parodied Barry's high-pitched cries, radio stations banned disco records. By the early 1980s, the Bee Gees were treated less like innovators and more like caricatures. Then came tragedy. In 2003, Morris Gibb died suddenly from a twisted intestine. Barry later admitted that singing falsetto after Morris's death was unbearable. "It breaks me up," he confessed. For him, falsetto wasn't just a style, it was the sound of brotherhood. Each note reminded him of voices now gone. When Robin passed away in 2012, the weight grew heavier. Falsetto, once their crown, became their ghost. Prince's falsetto had a different shadow. It was never mocked, only mystified. Fans adored it, critics praised it, but it also deepened his aura of untouchability. Prince was an enigma, a man who seemed untethered from normal rules. His falsetto was part of that mystique, sometimes playful, sometimes erotic, sometimes almost inhuman, but mystique has a cost. Falsetto, in Prince's world, was part of the distance he maintained from everyone else. Few people ever got close enough to ask him why he used it so often, or what it meant to him personally. It became a shield as much as a weapon. When Prince died in 2016, Tributes highlighted his falsetto as one of his signatures. No one mocked it, no one dismissed it, they celebrated it as revolutionary. The contrast with the Bee Gees' legacy was stark, and yet both shadows matter. For the Bee Gees, falsetto became a burden of grief. For Prince, falsetto became a veil of solitude. Together, their shadows remind us that falsetto was never just about sound, it was about identity, memory, and loss. So here we are, the heart of the battle. Falsetto wasn't just a high note, it was survival for the Bee Gees, it was rebellion for Prince. Play them side by side, and you'll hear it. Barry's falsetto in Stayin' Alive, urgent, collective, defiant. It's three brothers shouting into the void, daring the world to remember them. Prince's falsetto in Kiss, intimate, erotic, playful. It's one man bending gender, sexuality, and culture to his will. Both voices pierced the same airwaves, but with entirely different purposes. So who won? If victory means mainstream dominance, the Bee Gees had it first. If victory means cultural reverence, Prince claimed it after. But the truth is more complicated. Together they created a paradox. Falsetto could be mocked and worshipped at the same time. It could be a disco punchline and a revolutionary act. It could be survival and seduction, and maybe that's the real climax. It wasn't a fight between them, it was a fight inside falsetto itself. A fight between its power to liberate and its power to be ridiculed. And the haunting truth? Falsetto still carries that double edge today. So who really owned falsetto in pop music? The honest answer? No one. The Bee Gees gave falsetto its mainstream crown. Prince gave falsetto its permanent respect. One without the other would feel incomplete. Without the Bee Gees, falsetto might never have crossed into global pop. Without Prince, falsetto might never have been taken seriously again after disco's collapse. Today, when Bruno Mars belts in Treasure, you're hearing Bee Gees' urgency. When The Weeknd sighs in Earned It, you're hearing Prince's intimacy. When Justin Timberlake pleads in Cry Me a River, you're hearing both. Falsetto is no longer a novelty. It's a language, and that language exists because of both legacies. So maybe it's time to stop asking who won. Maybe the better question is, what did falsetto become because of them? It became a cry of survival, a whisper of seduction, a memory of grief, a symbol of rebellion. And that's why falsetto will never belong to one person. It belongs to music itself. So now I leave it with you. When you think of falsetto in pop, whose voice comes first? Barry Gibb's cry of survival or Prince's seductive whisper? Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe, because next time we'll dive into another untold battle, one that will forever change the way you hear the music you thought you knew.